I still remember the moment, as if it just happened yesterday. I was standing in my kitchen, folding laundry absent-mindedly, when my phone rang. I smiled as I picked it up, expecting to hear my daughter's cheerful voice, maybe to tell me about another wedding update. She had always been so excited about her big day, and I had promised myself I would do everything I could to make her dreams come true. But instead of her voice, it was his. My daughter's fiancé. His tone was cold, sharp, like he had practiced the words he was about to deliver. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just went straight to it. "Listen," he said flatly. "We've finalized the guest list. We only want important people at our wedding. You understand what that means, right?" At first, I didn't quite register it. The words swirled in my head like smoke, impossible to grasp. Important people? What did that even mean? I let out a small laugh, thinking maybe it was some kind of strange joke. But then he cleared his throat and said it again, slower this time, as though speaking to a child. "We only want important people there. You don't fit into that category." I felt my knees buckle beneath me, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. My chest burned, but I couldn't find any words. It was like my body refused to speak, afraid that if I did, I'd break into pieces right there. This man, this arrogant, smug boy who thought he was worthy of my daughter, had just told me I wasn't important enough to attend her wedding. My daughter's wedding. The very moment I had dreamed of since she was a little girl twirling around in my old dresses. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him who he thought he was, to tell him I was the woman who had given my daughter life, who had raised her through sickness and heartbreak, who had sacrificed everything for her happiness. But instead, I stayed silent. My throat closed up, and I could only whisper, "I see." And then I hung up the phone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the floor, the sound of his words echoing inside me like a cruel chant. "We only want important people. You don't fit into that category." For the first time in years, tears rolled down my face uncontrollably. Not the soft, quiet tears of sadness, but hot, angry tears that seared my skin as they fell. My hands shook. My heart raced. And yet, I didn't call my daughter. I didn't fight. I didn't beg. I simply wiped my face, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, "All right then. If I'm not important enough for their wedding, I'll make sure they understand just how important I really am." I didn't know it at that exact moment, but a quiet storm had begun inside me. And when it would break, it wouldn't just ruin their perfect little wedding. It would shatter everything they thought they controlled. After I hung up the phone, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, staring at the pile of folded laundry. My hands were still trembling, my chest still tight, but my mind had already begun its cruel replay. Memories came flooding back, snapshots of a life that had been built on sacrifices, on love, on an unshakable bond between mother and daughter. I remember the nights I stayed awake when she was just a little girl, fighting off fevers that made her tiny body shake. I remembered sitting at her bedside, whispering lullabies, stroking her hair, praying to anyone who would listen that she'd get better. I remembered when she was 12 and came home in tears after her classmates mocked her worn-out shoes. Shoes I had patched 3 times because I couldn't afford new ones yet. That night, I skipped dinner so I could set aside enough money for a new pair. When she slipped them on the next morning, her smile was worth every pang of hunger in my stomach. I remembered her teenage years, when she'd slam the door after shouting cruel words in the heat of adolescence. Words that cut deep. Words that left me crying into my pillow at night. But still, I loved her fiercely. Still, I forgave her every time. And then there were the moments of joy. Her graduation day. The way her eyes sparkled when she tossed her cap in the air. The tight hug she gave me afterward, whispering, "Mom, I couldn't have done this without you." I held on to that moment for years, like it was proof of everything I had given, everything I had poured into her. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. It was subtle at first. The phone calls grew shorter. The visits less frequent. She started talking more about him, the man who had become her fiancé. I tried to be happy for her. Truly I did. Every mother dreams of her daughter finding love, building a family, living a life better than her own. But I couldn't shake the unease that crept into me whenever his name came up. He was always dismissive. He would smile at me, but it never reached his eyes. He'd make little jokes at my expense, brushing them off as just teasing. My daughter would laugh along, not noticing the sting it left behind. And slowly, I began to feel like an outsider in her life. Now, sitting there after that phone call, I realized those cracks had only widened with time. My daughter, the child I had raised, the one I had sacrificed everything for, had chosen a man who saw me as unworthy. And worst of all, she let him. The thought tore me apart inside. Did she agree with him? Did she truly believe I wasn't important enough to be there on her wedding day? I wanted to believe she didn't. I wanted to believe this was just his cruelty, not hers. But deep down, something told me otherwise. The betrayal wasn't just his words, it was her silence. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew one thing for certain. By the time their wedding day came, they would regret underestimating me. The first night after that phone call, I barely slept. My body was exhausted, but my mind was alive with fire. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again. Sharp, dismissive, dripping with arrogance. "We only want important people at our wedding." Those words weren't just an insult. They were a declaration. A statement of where I stood in their lives. Nowhere. And yet, I smiled in the dark. Because I had learned something over the years that they hadn't. Sometimes silence is sharper than a scream, and patience more dangerous than rage. So instead of breaking down, I reached for my old leather address book. It was worn, its spine bent, its pages filled with names and numbers I hadn't dialed in years. My fingers hovered over them, and a strange calm washed over me. I didn't need to beg anyone for a seat at their wedding. No. I would let them keep their guest list of important people. But I would redefine what important truly meant. The first call I made was to an old friend, Jonathan Pierce. To my daughter, he was just the man who had attended a few of her childhood birthdays. To me, he was much more. Jonathan was a quiet man, soft-spoken, always polite. What most didn't know was that he had risen quietly, steadily, to become a senior partner at one of the city's most influential law firms. When he picked up the phone and heard my voice after all these years, his warmth nearly broke me. "Clara? My goodness, it's been forever." "Too long," I whispered, my throat tightening. We spoke for nearly an hour, catching up, weaving through small memories until I finally told him what had happened. I didn't need to embellish. Just the truth of my daughter's fiancé's words was enough to fill the silence on the other end. "I see," Jonathan finally said, his voice firm. "Leave this with me. Just trust me, Clara." And I did. The second call was even harder to make. It was to Margaret, my old employer. I had once worked as her assistant when I was younger, juggling work and motherhood. Margaret had been demanding but fair, and we had stayed loosely in touch. She now ran one of the largest catering businesses in the state, the very kind that supplied food and staff for high society weddings. When I told her what had happened, she was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed. "You always gave your best, Clara. Always. Let me give something back." I didn't ask her for anything specific. I didn't need to. Margaret was the kind of woman who understood. The third call was the most personal. To my cousin Peter. We hadn't spoken in years, not since a messy family dispute over inheritance. But Peter was a man who thrived in the world of finance and investments, and more importantly, he never forgot a grudge. When I explained my situation, his laugh was cold and sharp. "That boy doesn't know who he's marrying into, does he?" he said. "Clara, let me help." By the time I hung up the phone, it was nearly dawn. My body was tired, but my heart beat with something new. Not grief, not anger, but power. They thought I was nobody. They thought I was invisible. But invisibility is the most dangerous weapon. Because when no one sees you coming, no one knows how to stop you. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat back in my chair, and let the first real smile in days curl across my lips. The game had begun. The weeks leading up to the wedding unfolded like a cruel play I had no ticket to. I wasn't invited, of course. That phone call had made it clear enough. My daughter didn't call to soften the blow, didn't even text me to explain. She stayed silent. That silence hurt more than any insult ever could. But through the whispers of mutual acquaintances and the hum of a small town where gossip travels faster than light, I heard everything. The venue was extravagant, an estate outside the city, a place dripping with chandeliers, fountains, and marble floors. The kind of venue where people didn't just get married, they made statements. My daughter's fiancé wanted the wedding to be a performance, a showcase of wealth and connections. Their guest list was filled with businessmen, investors, people with titles before their names. And every detail was chosen for grandeur. A string quartet, imported flowers, a custom-designed cake from a baker whose waiting list was years long. It was everything they thought important people deserved. But what they didn't know was that the walls they were building so carefully had cracks. Cracks I had already begun to widen. I heard, for instance, that there had been sudden hiccups with the catering. Margaret's company, the one they'd proudly secured to provide for their elite guests, had quietly shifted their priorities. Unexpected scheduling issues. They were told. Replacement staff had to be hired at the last minute. Staff that, by coincidence, weren't as polished, not as discreet, not as loyal. And then there was Jonathan. He never told me exactly what he had done, I never asked. But word reached me that certain licenses for the venue, certain permits the fiancé had boasted about securing, were now under review. Nothing major, nothing to cancel the event, but enough to cause sleepless nights and frantic phone calls to lawyers. I didn't lift a finger. I simply waited. And as I waited, I thought. Every evening, I'd sit by the window of my small living room, watching the sky darken, wondering what my daughter was thinking. Did she ever pause in her frenzy of preparations to think of me? Did she feel guilt gnawing at her? Or had she buried it under layers of satin and lace? Sometimes I wanted to call her, to beg her to open her eyes, to remind her of who had held her hand all those years. This was about power, and my silence was becoming louder than any words I could have spoken. On the night before the wedding, I lit a single candle and sat at my kitchen table. Around me, the house was still, almost too still, like it was holding its breath. Tomorrow, they would stand in front of their carefully chosen audience, smug and untouchable. But tomorrow was also when they would learn what it truly meant to underestimate me. Because importance isn't measured in wealth or titles or the glitter of chandeliers. It's measured in the truth. And I was ready to reveal it. The morning of their wedding arrived with sunshine, so bright it almost mocked me. I sat by my window, sipping tea from my chipped mug, imagining the chaos unfolding at that grand estate miles away. Even without an invitation, I knew how the day would begin. The bridal suite filled with silk and lace, laughter bubbling between women adjusting veils and gowns. The groom bragging to his friends about the exclusive guest list, about how only the right people were allowed in their circle. I wasn't among them, of course. But my presence lingered in ways they didn't yet understand. By noon, whispers had already begun. The flowers, those imported, rare blooms they had bragged about for months, arrived half-wilted, their petals browned at the edges. The florist blamed transport delays, but Margaret's influence was there, subtle and precise. The string quartet they had paid a fortune for? 2 members called in sick that very morning, forcing a clumsy replacement with amateur musicians who stumbled through pieces guests politely pretended to enjoy. Small cracks, tiny imperfections. But on a day built entirely on appearances, they were enough to unsettle. I picture my daughter's fiancé pacing in his suit, snapping at staff, his carefully constructed image already slipping. My daughter. Oh, my sweet girl. I wondered if her smile faltered. If for just a second, she thought of me. The ceremony began late. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, fanning themselves with programs while murmurs grew louder. And just as vows were about to be exchanged, the estate manager quietly approached the groom with paperwork, permits suddenly under review, a legal snag Jonathan had hinted might occur. Nothing to stop the ceremony, but enough to draw every eye in the room as the groom's face flushed red with frustration. And then came the whispers. They spread like fire. about how the groom had mishandled certain investments, about debts he'd kept hidden, about deals collapsing just as quickly as this wedding was unraveling. Rumors Jonathan's firm had quietly seeded, carrying just enough truth to ignite suspicion. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. Because when arrogance is built on fragile ground, all it takes is one push. And my silence had been the push. I imagined my daughter standing there, veil trembling, smile frozen as her perfect day spiraled beyond her control. Her fiancé, red-faced and desperate, scrambling to maintain dignity. The important people in their carefully chosen seats, watching the illusion crumble piece by piece. I wasn't there in body, but I was everywhere in spirit. As they exchanged vows under the weight of whispers and wilting flowers, my phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan. 2 words. It worked. And I smiled. Not out of malice, not out of cruelty, but because in that moment they understood. Importance isn't dictated by guest lists or wealth. It's dictated by truth. And my silence had been the loudest truth of all. Receptions are supposed to be a celebration. A time when champagne flows freely, when laughter fills the air, when speeches bring tears of joy, not shame. But not this one. As I sat in my modest home, a single lamp lighting the room, I pictured it all unfolding exactly as I had intended. The grand hall glittered with chandeliers, tables dressed in white linen, glasses catching the light like jewels. Guests arrived in their finest, expecting elegance, perfection. But instead, they were greeted with the faint scent of wilting roses, the flowers already browning further under the heat of the room. Dinner was late. Plates arrived lukewarm, portions uneven. Margaret's quiet hand again, ensuring her replacement staff delivered service that was clumsy, rushed, and anything but seamless. Wine glasses went unfilled, desserts were delayed, and whispers began circling faster than the servers themselves. The groom's face grew darker with every passing minute. His carefully polished smile cracked, his jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. He snapped at waiters, muttered curses under his breath. And then came the speeches. One after another, voices took the microphone, but instead of praise, unease seeped in. Someone joked about the groom's big promises in business that hadn't exactly come true. Another laughed a little too sharply about debts dressed up as dreams. The laughter was awkward, forced, but the damage was done. By the time my cousin Peter arrived, oh yes, he had managed to get an invitation quietly and purposefully. He delivered the final blow. With a glass raised, his voice smooth and calculated, he toasted not to the happy couple, but to truth in relationships, both personal and financial. His words slid through the room like a blade, and though no names were spoken, every eye turned to the groom. Faces shifted from polite smiles to suspicion, from admiration to judgment. The room, filled with important people, had transformed into a silent jury. And my daughter? She sat beside him, veil removed, makeup smudged, her once radiant smile gone. I wondered if she thought of me then, if she realized how quickly the world she chose over me could crumble. The reception ended in whispers, not cheers. Guests slipped away early, some shaking their heads, others exchanging looks that said more than words ever could. The photographs captured none of this. They would show a beautiful bride, a decorated hall, a smiling groom. But photographs can't capture the truth in people's eyes, the weight of humiliation, the sting of betrayal exposed. As I blew out the candle on my table that night, the silence of my little home felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was powerful. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't begged. I hadn't demanded my place. I had simply reminded her, that I wasn't invisible. And in the quiet aftermath of their shattered perfection, my absence had been louder than any presence ever could be.